The conference room held 237 employees, every seat occupied, standing room only along the back wall, the quarterly all-hands meeting where leadership shared company performance, strategic updates, and celebrated team achievements. I stood near the presentation screen, having just finished walking through our engineering roadmap for the next fiscal year. 12 slides detailing product development timelines, technical milestones, resource allocation strategies, standard VP of engineering responsibilities at a company growing faster than anyone had predicted. That's when Vanessa Cartwright walked to the front of the room, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before. Not professional neutrality, something closer to satisfaction mixed with contempt. "Before we move to the next agenda item," she announced, her voice cutting through the ambient conversation, "we need to address a personnel matter that affects everyone here." The room went quiet. Personnel matters weren't typically discussed in all-hands meetings. Those conversations happened behind closed doors in HR offices with witnesses and documentation. Vanessa looked directly at me. "Jordan, would you come up here, please?" I walked to where she stood, confused, but maintaining composure. Vanessa was 31 years old, recently promoted to VP of Business Operations, daughter of our CEO, Howard Cartwright, who'd founded Helix Systems 19 years ago. She'd been with the company for 4 years, rising quickly through positions that coincidentally opened whenever she needed advancement. She held out the folder. "Sign here. Intern." The word landed like a slap. I wasn't an intern. I was Vice President of Engineering, had been for 6 years. Before that, Director of Engineering for 3 years. Before that, Senior Engineering Manager for 4 years, 13 years total at Helix Systems, starting when we had 43 employees and annual revenue of $8 million. "Excuse me?" I kept my voice level despite the confusion and growing awareness that something very wrong was happening. "Your termination paperwork," Vanessa said loudly enough for the room to hear. "We're eliminating your position effective immediately. Sign each page where indicated and security will escort you out." 237 people watching, phones already out. This moment being recorded from multiple angles. Public humiliation as deliberate management strategy. I opened the folder. Standard termination documentation, 3 copies of separation agreement, benefits termination notice, equipment return checklist, effective date listed as today, reason for termination, position elimination due to organizational restructuring. "Why is this being done publicly?" I asked quietly. "Because," Vanessa said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "transparency is important. Everyone should understand that no position is guaranteed. Performance matters. Results matter. When someone can't deliver what's needed, we make changes, regardless of tenure." The implication was clear. She was framing my termination as performance-based, while officially documenting it as position elimination, destroying my professional reputation in front of the entire company, while legally covering the company's exposure. I could have argued, could have pointed out that my performance reviews had been exemplary, could have challenged the characterization publicly, could have created a scene that would have felt justified, but ultimately accomplished nothing, except making me look desperate. Instead, I took out my pen and began reading. Every single page, every clause, every provision. While 237 people watched, and Vanessa shifted uncomfortably as the silence stretched beyond what she'd anticipated. The separation agreement was standard, 11 weeks of severance based on my tenure, health insurance continuation through April, non-disparagement and confidentiality clauses, standard non-compete preventing me from working for direct competitors for 18 months. What caught my attention wasn't in the termination paperwork. It was what wasn't included. No reference to Section 12 of my employment contract. No acknowledgement of the provisions I'd negotiated 13 years ago when Helix Systems had been desperate for engineering leadership, and I'd been deciding between their offer and a position at a much larger company. I signed every page, initialed every clause, dated each document, handed the folder back to Vanessa without a word. "Security will escort you out," she said, gesturing to 2 guards who'd apparently been waiting outside the conference room. "You have 30 minutes to collect personal belongings, no access to company systems, no downloading files or data." I walked out of that conference room with 237 people staring. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable. A few seemed satisfied to see someone senior get taken down publicly. Office politics creates strange allegiances. The security escort was professional but unnecessary. I packed my office in 18 minutes. Family photos, personal books, coffee mug my daughter had made in pottery class. The mechanical keyboard I'd bought myself because the company-issued equipment was garbage. Nothing company-owned, nothing that could be characterized as taking intellectual property. I drove home with my cardboard box on the passenger seat, expecting to feel angry or humiliated or panicked about sudden unemployment. Instead, felt something closer to anticipation. Because Vanessa had made a critical error. She'd publicly humiliated me, called me an intern in front of the entire company. Made my termination hostile and retaliatory in nature, despite the paperwork claiming it was simple restructuring. And hostile termination triggered very specific protections I'd negotiated into my employment contract 13 years ago when nobody at Helix Systems had believed those protections would ever matter. My name is Jordan Blackwell. I'm 46 years old. Until approximately 2 hours ago, I was Vice President of Engineering at Helix Systems, an enterprise software company specializing in data analytics platforms for healthcare organizations. 13 years I'd been there, starting as senior engineering manager when the company was still figuring out product market fit and barely surviving quarter to quarter. I joined Helix in 2011. The company had been founded 2 years earlier by Howard Cartwright, a former hospital administrator who'd recognized that healthcare organizations were drowning in data but had no effective tools for analyzing it. Howard had a vision and industry connections, but zero technical expertise. Helix's first engineering team had been contractors who'd built a functional but unscalable prototype. Howard hired me to transform that prototype into actual product, build an engineering organization, create architecture that could handle the data volumes healthcare systems generated. My offer negotiation had been contentious. Howard wanted to hire me cheaply with promises of future equity. I wanted guaranteed protection if the company ever decided senior employees were too expensive. We'd compromised with a complex contract. Base salary of $94,000, which was below market rate for someone with my background. Aggressive equity grant of 1.8% of the company, which was extremely generous for a hire that wasn't founding team. Annual performance bonuses tied to product development milestones, and several unusual contractual provisions that my attorney had insisted on including. Section 12F, specifically, in the event employee experiences hostile termination, defined as termination accompanied by public humiliation, reputation damage, or other actions suggesting retaliatory intent beyond standard employment separation. Employee may execute immediate buyback of all vested equity at fair market value as determined by most recent company valuation. Company shall complete buyback within 60 days of written notice. This provision exists to protect employee from situations where continued equity holding becomes untenable due to hostile relationship with company leadership. My attorney, Ruth Takahashi, had seen too many executives get fired from companies they'd helped build, then forced to watch their equity value evaporate because they had no liquidity options and the company controlled all sale opportunities. Section 12F created forced liquidity if the company made termination hostile rather than professional. Howard's attorney had questioned the provision, but in 2011, Helix was worth almost nothing. The company had barely $3 million in revenue and was burning through cash faster than they could raise it. A buyback provision on 1.8% equity seemed like theoretical protection that would never actually matter. 13 years later, Helix Systems was substantially different. We'd grown to 847 employees, annual revenue of $327 million. Most recent Series E funding round in February had valued the company at $2.6 billion. My 1.8% equity stake, 94% of which had vested through time-based schedules, was theoretically worth approximately $44 million at current valuation. Theoretically, because private company equity isn't liquid, can't be sold without company approval, only converts to actual money during acquisition or IPO, which might be years away. But Section 12F changed that calculation if termination was hostile, and Vanessa had just made my termination as hostile as legally possible. Public humiliation in front of entire company, calling me intern despite my VP title, creating reputational damage that would follow me professionally, all documented by multiple phone recordings that I was certain were already being shared internally and would eventually leak externally. The question was whether Helix Systems had the cash to complete a buyback of $44 million in equity. Most startups don't keep that kind of cash on hand, but Helix had just raised $180 million in Series E funding. According to the financial updates shared during quarterly board meetings, the company currently held approximately $230 million in liquid assets. They had the money. Whether they'd voluntarily honor Section 12F was a different question. I spent the afternoon reviewing my employment contract with Ruth Takahashi, who'd handled my legal matters for 16 years and had been copied on every contract amendment Helix had ever proposed. "Tell me exactly what happened," Ruth said, sitting across from me in her office 3 hours after my termination. I described the all-hands meeting, Vanessa's public call-out, the intern comment, the security escort, the entire performance designed to humiliate rather than simply separate employment. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, reading through my contract. Section 12F is explicit. Hostile termination triggers immediate buyback rights. The intern comment alone establishes hostile intent. Doing it publicly in front of 200-plus witnesses makes it indisputable. Will they honor it voluntarily? Unlikely. They probably don't even know the provision exists. Your original contract is 13 years old. Current leadership may not have reviewed it carefully. When's the last time Helix proposed contract amendments? 4 years ago, when I was promoted to VP, they wanted to add some intellectual property clauses. I agreed in exchange for extending my equity vesting schedule. So your current contract is the amended version from 4 years ago, which still includes Section 12F? Correct. We amended other sections, but left the hostile termination buyback intact. Ruth pulled up something on her laptop. Helix's recent valuation was $2.6 billion. Your 1.8% stake, 94% vested, equals approximately $44 million at that valuation. Do they have the cash? They raised $180 million in February. Last board update showed $230 million in liquid assets. Then they can afford the buyback. Question is whether they'll fight it or settle quickly to avoid publicity. Ruth looked at me seriously. Jordan, you need to understand what executing this provision means. You're forcing the company to liquidate $44 million of equity immediately. That's a massive cash drain. It might impact their runway, delay hiring plans, affect strategic initiatives. You'll be blamed for that impact. They publicly humiliated me, called me an intern after 13 years of building their engineering organization, destroyed my professional reputation in front of everyone. I'm supposed to just accept that. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying be prepared for them to fight hard. They'll argue the termination wasn't hostile. They'll claim the intern comment was casual language, not deliberate insult. They'll try to characterize the all-hands termination as transparency rather than humiliation. There are phone recordings, multiple angles, witnesses who heard everything. Good. We'll need those recordings. Start gathering evidence immediately. Contact people who were present. Request copies of any video or audio captured. Build comprehensive documentation of exactly what happened and how it was perceived by observers. I spent the next 3 hours doing exactly that. Reached out to 7 current Helix employees I trusted. All 7 confirmed they'd witnessed the termination. 4 were willing to provide written statements describing it as hostile and deliberately humiliating. 3 had video recordings they agreed to share confidentially. That evening, I drafted formal notice to Helix Systems exercising my rights under Section 12F. The letter was clinical and precise. Pursuant to Section 12F of my employment agreement dated March 14, 2011, as amended June 22, 2020, I hereby provide written notice of my election to execute immediate buyback of all vested equity. My termination on today's date constitutes hostile termination as defined by the agreement due to the following factors. 1. Termination was conducted publicly during company-wide meeting rather than privately. 2. Termination included deliberate reputational damage via characterization of my role as intern, despite my title and 13 years of service. 3. Termination included unnecessary security escort, suggesting untrustworthiness despite exemplary performance history. Under Section 12F, Helix Systems shall complete buyback within 60 days at fair market value based on most recent company valuation of $2.6 billion. My vested equity percentage is 1.69%, 94% of 1.8% total grant. representing approximately $43.94 million at current valuation. Please confirm receipt and provide proposed buyback timeline. Ruth reviewed the letter and suggested one addition. Include a paragraph noting that you're open to discussing this matter collaboratively, but will pursue legal enforcement if necessary. Give them an off-ramp that doesn't require immediate litigation. I added the suggested paragraph and sent the letter via certified mail and email to Howard Cartwright, Helix's general counsel Diane Richardson, and the company's registered agent. Sent at 8:47 in the evening. Confirmation receipts arrived within minutes for the email copies. Then I waited. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Let people discover what they've triggered and make the first move. The call came sooner than expected. 11:23 that same night. Unknown number with San Francisco area code, which meant it was 8:23 local time there, where Helix maintained their legal operations. Jordan Blackwell speaking. Mr. Blackwell, this is Diane Richardson from Helix Systems. I apologize for the late hour, but I need to discuss the letter you sent this evening regarding Section 12AF of your employment agreement. I'm listening, Diane. First, let me say that if today's termination process felt hostile or unprofessional, that was not leadership's intent. We value your contributions over 13 years. The all-hands format was chosen for transparency with the team, not to cause embarrassment. Diane, Vanessa called me an intern in front of the entire company. That wasn't transparency. That was deliberate humiliation. Brief pause. I wasn't present at the meeting. I'm hearing conflicting accounts of what was said and how it was framed. Can you walk me through specifically what happened? I described the sequence. Vanessa's announcement, the public document signing, the intern comment, the immediate security escort. The performance designed to demonstrate that senior leadership wasn't protected from sudden termination. I see. That's more detailed than the version I received from Vanessa. Let me be direct. The buyback provision in Section 12AF is unusual. I've reviewed your employment agreement, and yes, the language is there. However, our position is that your termination wasn't hostile. It was a straightforward restructuring handled with appropriate transparency. Appropriate transparency would have been private meeting with HR present. Appropriate restructuring wouldn't have included calling me an intern. Appropriate separation wouldn't have required security escort for an employee with 13 years of exemplary service. Diane, you know what hostile termination looks like. This was textbook. Mr. Blackwell, even if we accept your characterization, the buyback amount you're claiming is not realistic. $44 million is substantial cash drain on company resources. That's not something we can execute quickly or without significant impact to operations. Section 12F doesn't give Helix discretion based on convenience. It specifies 60-day completion at fair market value based on most recent valuation. Those are the terms Howard agreed to 13 years ago. Terms that were agreed to when the company was worth a fraction of current value. Nobody anticipated this provision being triggered at this scale. We need to discuss reasonable modification. I'm open to discussing timeline and structure, but not the fundamental obligation. Helix made my termination hostile. Section 12F triggers. The buyback happens. How it's structured can be negotiated, but whether it happens isn't up for debate. Long silence on Diane's end, background voices filtering through. She was conferencing with others, probably Howard and possibly Helix's board representatives. Would you be willing to meet tomorrow morning with leadership to discuss resolution options? We're prepared to make this situation right, but we need to understand your expectations and find mutually acceptable path forward. I'll meet with leadership, but understand that my attorney will be present, and this isn't negotiation about whether the buyback happens, only about how it's structured to minimize operational impact while honoring contractual obligations. Understood. 9 a.m. at our office? Agreed. The meeting the next morning included more people than I'd expected. Howard Cartwright sitting at the head of the table, looking older than his 62 years. Diane Richardson with files spread in front of her. Marcus Webb from Helix's outside counsel. And surprisingly, Randall Foster, the lead board member representing the Series E investors who'd put in $80 million 6 months ago. Notably absent, Vanessa Cartwright. The person who'd triggered this entire situation wasn't invited to help resolve it. Jordan, thank you for coming, Howard began, his tone suggesting this was casual conversation rather than legal negotiation. I want to start by saying that yesterday's termination process was mishandled. Vanessa's approach was not what I would have chosen. She's young, still learning appropriate management techniques. The public format and certain comments were inappropriate. Howard, with respect, Vanessa is 31 years old and a VP. She's not an intern learning basics. She knew exactly what she was doing. The question now is how Helix addresses the contractual consequences. Marcus Webb leaned forward. Mr. Blackwell, we've reviewed Section 12F carefully. The language does provide buyback rights upon hostile termination. However, hostile termination is defined somewhat vaguely. The provision lists public humiliation and reputation damage as factors, but doesn't establish clear threshold for what constitutes hostility versus normal business separation. Multiple witnesses heard Vanessa call me an intern. Multiple people recorded the interaction. Normal business separation doesn't involve deliberate insults and public humiliation. The threshold is clearly met. One comment during a stressful situation doesn't necessarily establish pattern of hostile intent, Marcus argued. Vanessa may have misspoken. The term might have been used casually without intent to demean. Ruth pulled out her tablet. I have written statements from 4 Helix employees who were present. All 4 characterized the interaction as deliberately hostile. Additionally, I have 3 video recordings from different angles showing Vanessa's body language and tone. This wasn't misspeaking. This was calculated humiliation. If you'd like, we can review the videos right now. Howard held up his hand. That won't be necessary. I believe Jordan's account. The question is what happens next. Randall Foster spoke for the first time. The Series E term sheet includes protective provisions about company cash management. Executing a $44 million buyback impacts our runway and could trigger investor protections, allowing us to adjust our equity positions. This isn't just about Helix honoring a contract. It affects all stakeholders. That's not my problem, I said bluntly. Your investment protections don't supersede my employment contract. Helix created hostile termination. Section 12F triggers. The buyback happens. How it affects your investor protections is between you and Helix's board. We could litigate, Marcus said. Argue that Section 12F is unenforceable due to changed circumstances. The provision was negotiated when company value was minimal. Enforcing it now at scale creates unconscionable burden. Try it, Ruth responded. But understand that litigation makes this public. Every detail of how Vanessa humiliated Jordan becomes part of public record. All witness statements become discoverable. All those video recordings get entered as evidence. Helix's reputation as employer that publicly humiliates senior leadership becomes national story. How do you think that impacts recruiting and retention? The room went quiet. Tech companies live and die by their ability to attract talent. A public story about VP being called intern during termination and escorted out by security would be recruiting poison. What do you want? Howard asked finally. Forget the posturing. What would resolve this? Full buyback per Section 12 and F. $44 million at $2.6 billion valuation. Completed within 60 days as contracted. But I'm willing to structure it to minimize operational impact. $30 million upfront, $14 million in structured payments over 2 years. That gives Helix time to manage cash flow while honoring the obligation. $30 million upfront is still massive drain, Randall said. Your Series E raised $180 million. You currently hold approximately $230 million in liquid assets. You can afford $30 million. Whether you want to is a different question. Howard looked at Randall, then at Marcus, then back to me. If we agree to your structure, we need complete release. No future claims, no discussion of the termination circumstances, no negative comments about Helix or its leadership. I'll sign a release for legal claims, but I won't sign away my right to discuss what happened truthfully if asked. Vanessa made this public. She chose to humiliate me in front of the entire company. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen because it's inconvenient for Helix. That's unacceptable, Marcus said immediately. Any settlement requires confidentiality and non-disparagement. Then we have no settlement. I'll enforce Section 12F through legal action. The buyback happens either way. Only question is whether it happens quietly through negotiation or publicly through litigation. Choose. More silence, more exchanged glances, more calculation of which option was worse. We need to caucus, Diane said. Can you give us 30 minutes? Ruth and I left the conference room. waited in the lobby while Helix's leadership team debated behind closed doors. I could see them through the glass walls, animated discussion. Howard looking frustrated. Randall on his phone, probably conferencing with other investors. 28 minutes later, Diane emerged. We have a proposal. $35 million upfront, $9 million in annual payments over 2 years. No interest on the delayed portion. Release of legal claims, but no non-disparagement clause. You're free to discuss your employment and termination truthfully. Settlement documentation includes Helix's acknowledgement that termination process could have been handled more professionally. It was better than my initial proposal. The acknowledgement language was valuable because it created record that Helix recognized the termination was problematic. Agreed, subject to reviewing final settlement documentation. The settlement agreement took 2 weeks to finalize. $35 million transferred to my account on day 16. 2 structured payments of $4.5 million scheduled for subsequent years. Comprehensive release of all legal claims related to employment and termination. Explicit statement that I retained all rights to discuss my employment experience truthfully. Most importantly, the settlement included this paragraph. Helix Systems acknowledges that the termination process implemented on date could have been conducted more professionally and that certain aspects of the termination may have been reasonably perceived as hostile by the affected employee. While Helix does not admit to contractual violation, the company recognizes that employment separations should be handled with dignity and respect regardless of seniority level. That paragraph meant everything. It was Helix admitting in writing that they'd screwed up. That Vanessa's performance wasn't acceptable, that senior leadership deserved better treatment. 3 months after the settlement, I got a call from Malcolm Pritchard, who'd been present at the all-hands meeting and had recently been promoted to VP of Product. We met for coffee in neutral territory. You need to know something, Malcolm said quietly. The board conducted an investigation after your settlement, interviewed witnesses, reviewed the video recordings, examined Vanessa's communications leading up to your termination. What did they find? She'd been planning it for weeks, wanted to demonstrate to younger employees that tenure didn't protect people from accountability. Specifically, chose the all-hands format for maximum visibility. The intern comment wasn't spontaneous. She'd practiced the whole speech, including that line. Why are you telling me this? Because the board fired Vanessa last week. Not for terminating you, that was within her authority, for how she did it and the financial consequences. The $44 million settlement got charged to her department's budget for the year, destroyed her operational metrics, made her look incompetent to the board. Howard wanted to protect his daughter, but the Series E investors demanded accountability. So Vanessa's attempt to publicly demonstrate power had ended her career. The intern comment that was supposed to humiliate me had cost her approximately $44 million and her VP position. How's Howard handling it? Badly. He's talking about stepping down as CEO, bringing in outside leadership. The board's been pushing for that anyway. Your situation gave them leverage to force the change. 6 months later, Howard announced his retirement. Helix brought in experienced CEO from healthcare tech company with track record of successful exits. New leadership team cleaned out several other executives who'd been hired based on relationships rather than competence. The company went public 14 months after my termination. IPO priced at $41 per share. First day trading pushed it to $53. At that valuation, my theoretical equity would have been worth approximately $89 million if I'd still held it. But I'd already received $44 million from the buyback settlement. Walked away with generational wealth because I'd negotiated protection 13 years earlier that nobody thought would ever matter. The lesson isn't about revenge or vindication. It's about understanding that employment contracts aren't just formalities. They're binding agreements that create real protections if you negotiate them properly and enforce them when violated. When I'd negotiated Section 12F in 2011, Howard's attorney had tried to remove it. Too unusual, too potentially expensive, created unnecessary risk. But I'd insisted because I'd watched too many executives build companies only to be discarded when they became expensive or inconvenient. The protection seemed theoretical then, but theory became reality when Vanessa decided public humiliation was acceptable management technique. I'm Jordan Blackwell. I'm 46 years old. I got called an intern and fired in front of 237 employees after 13 years building Helix Systems' engineering organization. The person who thought she was demonstrating power triggered contractual provision that cost the company $44 million and ended her own career. The cardboard box I carried out that day held personal items worth maybe $300. The employment contract I'd negotiated 13 years earlier held protections worth $44 million. Both mattered, but knowing your contracts and when to enforce them matters more than most people realize. Sometimes the best response to public humiliation isn't anger or immediate retaliation. Sometimes it's quietly reading your contract, understanding what just triggered, and letting the consequences unfold exactly as written. Because when companies stop treating terminations with basic dignity and respect, those terminations can become extraordinarily expensive in ways nobody anticipated.